Good morning, BookTube, YouTube. This is Johnny. We're still in the last day of May. It is the 31st of May. It is 10:20 late morning. It is a hot day here in West Michigan. My wife said we'll probably turn on the air conditioner, central air. When we first moved into this house 33 years ago, we didn't have central air. The kids were little, they were in elementary school, but I don't know when we put in central air, but it is really nice. You shut the house all up, you just control your environment. As my routine is, I'm writing in the morning. In my diary, I'm on page 461 for the year 2023. Reading The Zealous Christian by Christopher Love. He lived from 1618 to 1651. This book was mentioned in this book I showed you yesterday, Living Zealously by Joel R. Beakey and James A. LaBelle. It was mentioned in the back of the book. I have some of these books that they refer to, and one of them they referred to was Christopher Love. So I got it out to read for morning devotions. This video is primarily going to focus on a question I get a lot on my videos, and they always ask me the question, do you read all the books that you show in your videos? And obviously, no, I don't. But I think I've answered this question in past videos, but I have like 1,600 videos, and I don't expect people to look or watch past videos. So I answered the question this morning. Somebody said that they asked me this question twice and I had failed to answer it. I'm sorry. Sometimes I can't find comments. I mean, I try to answer all comments, at least comments that seem that I can understand. Sometimes I get comments that kind of confuse me. I don't know what the comment means, but so going back, do I read all the books that I show in my videos? No. I am a book collector. By God's divine goodness and His blessings, my wife and I, we own a big house. When I grew up, I lived in small little duplexes. As I mentioned, that when my mother was killed in an auto wreck in 1960, well, it wasn't an auto wreck, and she didn't stop for a speeding ambulance, which is coming home from work late at night in December of 1968. And she didn't stop, and an ambulance hit her, and she was killed instantly. And she was divorced. And I was 16 years old, oldest of 5. I'm the oldest brother. I have a brother after me. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters who are younger than me. Of course, I'm 70, so you know how old they are. I think my brother after me is 65, and I think I have a brother who is 60, maybe, late 50s. And I have a sister who's in her 50s and a sister who's in her late 50s. But the point is, I didn't grow up with people who read books. When I was growing up, I've always loved books. Like when I was a boy, we used to have the bookmobile would come in our neighborhood, and I would always go to the bookmobile and check out books. And when I was growing up as a boy, you go to a grocery store, they always sold encyclopedias. And I would go to the local grocery store where we lived, and I walk over there, and I would sit on the floor in the aisles, and I would look at the encyclopedias. And I remember when one time we visited my grandfather. He collected National Geographics, and I remember he was a photographer. He was a civil engineer by profession, but he was into photography, and he had all kinds of books around his little apartment. My grandmother died when I was just born. So my grandfather, as far as I know, never remarried. So when we visited him, he lived in a basement apartment, an open basement apartment in Illinois. But he had books around his. One time we visited him, and I remember looking at his photography books and National Geographic, and there was a bookmobile, and I would go to shopping centers, grocery stores, and look. And then I remember going to the library when I was in elementary school, and but my grandfather gave me Bibles for presents. He also gave me books one time when I was about 9 or 8 years old. That's a long story. I can't go on. This video is going on 6 minutes already. So I always had a Bible. I still have the Bibles that my grandfather gave me, and I read those. But when I was growing up, there were no books in the little places that we lived. I mean, there were like romance magazines and maybe trashy novels, but my mother didn't read. My stepfathers didn't read, and I was mostly, when I was growing up, especially before I was into TV. When I was growing up, you turned the TV on when you got up in the morning, and you turned the TV off when you went to bed. And when I was growing up, my mother was a barmaid or a cocktail waitress, and so I'd stay up to 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock watching Johnny Carson and talk shows and horror films. But I liked talk shows. I used to watch William F. Buckley, and I used to watch on Sunday Oral Roberts, the Pentecostal preacher. I was always into TV. And then when my mother was killed in 1968, I went to live with my aunt. We were living in Los Angeles when my mother was killed, and I went to live with my aunt, who lived in the San Francisco Bay Area in San Pablo, California, which is Richmond. Then you have Berkeley and Alameda, El Cerrito. And I was, but it's a long story. I got into a foster family. Well, it was really just a German. She had left Germany at the beginning of the Second World War, and it's a long story, but I lived with her. She was divorced. She was German, bohemian, kind of into organic living, and she lived had a farm with horses and goats and chickens, and she had one son. And I lived with them when I was in the 11th grade. And when I was in the 11th grade, I was mostly into the San Francisco music scene. I got into smoking cannabis and had girlfriends. And then when I was in the 12th grade, what is the meaning of life? Who am I? The existentialist crisis. I went to Young Life, which is a Christian kind of thing, and I got into the high world faith. And then, as you all know, in the summer of 1970, I was searching, and I lifted my eyes up to the sky one day when I was hiking after I graduated from high school, and I said, God, if you exist, show me who you are. If you exist. And you all know the story. A couple weeks later, I was in Berkeley, and I came across the Jesus people, and they invited me to a Bible study, and since 1970 I have been walking with the Lord. So then when I first became a Christian, the big thing was the Bible. And I used the Bible, one of the Bibles my grandfather gave me. And when you're a Christian, you go to Bible studies, you go to Sunday school, you read books. And I was involved with Jesus People, and you read Christian books like, by Christian writers. And then in 1975, I was reading a commentary on the Epistle of Hebrews by A.W. Pink, and I've mentioned this in past videos, that Pink quotes the Puritans, the 17th century English Puritans. John Owen wrote a massive commentary on the Epistle of Hebrews and other Puritans, and then I got into the English Puritans, and I won't go into all the details. But the point is, in reading Pink and reading the Puritans, I became reformed. Before I was like a charismatic Jesus people. I was into the charismatic, dispensational, premillennial, eschatology, and all that. But when I got into reading the Puritans and got into the Reformed faith and got into reading Calvinism, and then I joined an Orthodox Presbyterian church there in Berkeley, and they had a huge library of Puritan reprints, and I read those, and I go to seminaries there in Berkeley that had old 17th century English Puritan volumes, and I'd read those. And I didn't have any money in those days, but I used seminary libraries to read the old writers and Calvinistic literature. And I bought a few books, and I didn't have much money in those days, very little money. So the point is, when you come into the Reformed faith and you get into Presbyterian, conservative, evangelical theology, it's books. You might have heard that Presbyterians are called the frozen few. They tend to be very intellectual, very educated. One thing about Presbyterians, they believe in an educated ministry. When I wanted to become a gospel minister, you have to go to 4 years of college and 2 or 3 years of seminary, and then you have to do an internship. So Presbyterians traditionally believe in an educated ministry. You have to have a bachelor's degree, and then you have to have a master's degree, and then today in Presbyterianism, they like ministers to have their doctorates. The minister I did my internship in after I finished seminary had a doctorate in historical theology. And some ministers who are Presbyterians get doctorates in New Testament studies, Old Testament theology, systematic theology, historical theology. So the whole point is that if you're into conservative, Presbyterian, Calvinistic, 17th century English Puritanism, you tend to have a lot of books. Ministers in my theological, spiritual tradition have huge libraries. They have commentaries, they have systematic theologies, they have just huge libraries. And so when I got into Bible college and seminary, you start buying books. You become educated in church history, Old Testament, New Testament, biblical studies, New Testament theology, Old Testament theology, modern philosophy, Christian ethics. It just goes on and on. So you start buying all these books because as a minister, you have to preach to the Bible from Genesis to Revelations. In conservative Presbyterian churches, they preach through the Bible, through books of the Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. That's what you do. You teach and you preach the Bible. And you take a text, you preach, you explain the text, its literal meaning, its historical, its spiritual, and you apply it to your congregation. So you have to have a huge library. And then you have your own reading that you do to relax. Maybe some ministers read westerns, or they read biographies, or they read history, or they read on cultural events. So you get a big library. So I had a big library after going to Bible college and after going to seminary and after doing my internship. I had a huge Christian library. I had a lot of books. So then when I didn't, and then I worked for about 13, well, I didn't go into the ministry, you know that story. Carol and I moved up here 33 years ago. Carol grew up here in Holland, Michigan. And we've been married 44 years, so I've had the money to buy books. I've worked at, I had jobs over the years, and I had good deals, discounts, and bought damaged Christian books. So I was able to accumulate a lot of books. So when I stopped working in 2007, the kids were growing up, our children were growing up, finished college, were off having their own careers, their professions, getting married and having kids. So it was just Carol and I here. And then when I was working and when I was going to school, I didn't have time to read outside of my Christian interest. But when I stopped working, one day my wife and I were at some thrift store, and I noticed that they were selling used books. So then I started collecting used books, and I started collecting the books that I read when I was in my 20s, when I was in high school. And then I started reading books. I was always been interested in history. I've always been interested in biography since I've been keeping a diary since 1968. And when I was in high school, in my early 20s, I was into Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg. I was always into avant-garde literature, Henry Miller, Annis Nin. I've always been interested in the history of drugs and the history of bohemianism and avant-garde. And I've always been interested in high school and throughout my life in art, the history of art, artists. I've always been interested in poetry and poets, and I've always been interested in spiritual things, Christian spirituality, mysticism, alternating your consciousness through psychedelics and drugs and all kinds of things I was interested in, but I didn't have the energy or time when my kids were growing up and I was going through education and I was working. I didn't have the time or energy to pursue outside of my Christian interest. But when I stopped working and I found about thrift stores, and then I started going to used book sales, and then I started volunteering at the Book Nook, the library used bookstore, and then over the years I've accumulated the books that I would gravitate towards due to my interest in art and music and history and biography and memoirs and letters and essays and literary criticism. Even when I was younger, I was always into Saul Billows and John Updike. I was always into Negatov, and I was always interested in writers like that. And then as I got more into reading American literature, and then now I'm into translation literature, books out of translation, and it just spreads, it just explodes. And so that's how and now, since I'm an introvert, I'm a kind of a loner, I don't really have friends. I read and I write, and I go out to thrift stores or used book sales or to the Book Nook, and I buy used books. And I do buy some new books, but I generally I can find what I want to read at at thrift stores. Like I bought this book, The History of Bombing. I bought a couple of weeks ago at the local Goodwill. And I bought it for like 90 cents. And I bought this book from Amazon used, Artificial Paradises, a drug reader. I bought this used. So you can find good used books at thrift stores, Goodwill, Salvation Army. You can find them from buying from Amazon. So that's how I got into collecting books. And now I've always loved books. And now I have the space, I have the resources, and I have been getting rid of books. As you know, I dehauled a bunch of books. Today, my wife and I are going to Blue Stockings. We're going to dehaul some books for in-store credit. And so, no, I don't read all the books that you see in my videos, but I read all the time. I'm always reading about books, going to libraries, reading reviews, doing research, studying the history of a literature, studying the history of art or music or poetry or history of America or Christian history or medieval history or medieval theology, reading about St. Thomas Aquinas or reading about Bonaventure or the patristic fathers, where I'm reading about Kerouac, where I'm reading about some art movement in Paris in the 1930s. It just goes on and on and on. So you find out about books, you look for them, you come across them, you find them used, and you buy them, and you start accumulating a library. So this is going on 22 minutes. I just thought, no, I don't read all the books that you see in my videos. I am a book lover. I am a book freak. I love books. I love libraries. I love going to used bookstores. I love looking for books, searching for books, reading about books, reading about writers and poets and artists. That's what I do. So until next time, bye.